all here to help you become a better negotiator. A couple of questions first. Have you ever been short-tempered and rushed to solutions too quickly in a negotiation and missed the opportunity to arrive at better alternatives? Have you ever assumed that there was only one answer to your question? Have you ever thought that you were successful and thus the other party wasn't, that you won and they lost? Were you ever convinced that it was up to the other party to find a solution to their problem? Did you say yes to any of these questions? Don't worry, most people did. But they are examples of negotiations that lead to a bad outcome. Because a negotiation is all about reaching an agreement that benefits all parties, or as we say, mutual gain. In other words, it's about finding a solution that satisfies as many interests of all parties as possible. And that's principle 3, inventing options for mutual gain. I hear you. Finding such a solution is hard, and brainstorming is the answer. Put all the ideas on the table that come up. Good ideas, bad ideas, realistic, unrealistic, predictable, over the top. Write them all down. It's crucial in this stage that you don't criticize them or don't evaluate them. Oh, when you're done with your brainstorm, maybe you can ask the other party to brainstorm together with you. Or maybe that's too advanced for you. Now that you have all these ideas, you can refine them, improve them, and combine them. And only when that is done, it's time to judge them based on objective criteria. But more on that later. First, let's look at an example of brainstorming based on interests.
So, inventing options for a mutual gain. I actually find myself very often in brainstorming sessions. In discussions with companies, with people, I'm not a person with a one-stop solution. I'm a person with a clear demand, but then we need to brainstorm together on how we can actually get to something that is mutually interesting. In such a brainstorm, I find it important to be professional. So we go from a long list to a short list. I'm very often the person taking notes, and I also share my notes afterwards, because sometimes ideas only develop themselves after the meeting as well. I also typically use an Excel file to calculate what do we want, what do we need, how we get there. And in this process of brainstorming, you get this co-creation vibe. And I find it very interesting to see this co-creation vibe. If we can co-create a solution together, I find that people will continue to work with us because it's also their solution. It's also their little baby that they have created together with us.
So, you have a lot of ideas on the table. It's time to judge them, to come to an agreement and find a solution that fits all parties. How? By applying principle 4. Insist on using objective criteria. Suppose you go on a holiday with friends. Before deciding where to go, it might be interesting to decide first which objective criteria you will use to evaluate your ideas. For example, do you want to take into account CO2 emissions on your trip? Or maybe the price per person per week, right? If you agree on these objective criteria ahead of the brainstorm phase, it will be a lot easier to check your ideas after and to agree on one of them. Let's zoom in on 2 types of objective criteria: standards and procedures. You can use established standards that are completely independent of the will of both parties. For example, the price or the market value or scientific evidence, and so on. You can also use rational procedures. For example, when you're sharing a pizza. One person can split the pizza and the other one can choose the part. That's called the split or choose procedure. Or take turns. One by one, you choose which part of the pizza you want. Or you pull a straw, you throw a die to decide who gets the biggest part. Those are 3 examples of rational procedures. So, to evaluate your ideas at the end of a negotiation, it's important to have an agreement on these objective criteria, preferably before the brainstorm phase.
So, talking about objective criteria, we are a social enterprise, so we focus on impact, but that does not mean that we do not use KPIs, that we do not use business objectives. So for us, objective criteria are that we want to activate as many used IT assets that we can. So we try to maximize on the number of computers that we can redeploy, but we also want to make sure that we don't lose money in the process. So we always also focus on combining maximum impact with sufficient profitability. By beginning with the end in mind, we very often see that we have good discussions, also internally, but also with companies in the process when negotiating and in brainstorms. But beginning with the end in mind is for us a good concept.
As you can see, it entirely depends on what you believe are reasonable standards. Don't always assume that market value is the only important objective criterion. There's also social and societal considerations to take into account. Look at Didier Appels, for example. He clearly wants to make as big of an impact as possible, which makes sense for a social entrepreneur.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
Okay, my dear friends, for our next trip, the objective criteria for my travel partners are being nice. That means you can't come, Ahmed, because you're a total douche. Second, being funny. Sorry, Michael, but you're so unfunny that it makes me cry. Third of all, being interesting. David, you're more boring than my dead grandmother, so I guess I'm traveling alone. Thanks a lot, guys. Jesus Christ, stupid friends.
Did you think a deal with no ill feeling was an illusion? Did you think there were only win or lose negotiations? Well, you were wrong. There's also a win-win possibility thanks to these 4 principles based on understanding and reasonableness rather than emotion and willpower.